But before we come to the 10 Commandments, how should we approach these? How should we look at these 10 Commandments? Particularly as we're not the Old Testament people, we're not the covenant people of Israel. What lens should we use to view these? Should we view them maybe as a tick list? Should God's people have viewed them as a tick list, things that need to kind of work on each day to justify themselves before God? If they can tick off these things, do these things, they can earn God's favor and acceptance. Or were they already God's people? Were they already favored and accepted? And this was just a response on things that they were to do as part of their relationship with God. Well, the good news is in verse 2. It is the latter. And if you haven't got your Bibles open before you, please do open them to Exodus 20. I really want you to see not my words, but the words of God coming through this morning. Verse 2 gives us the answer. It says this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You see, they had already been saved. They had already been rescued by God because of his great love for them. They didn't need to try and justify themselves by following these 10 commandments. They were already part of God's family. This is akin to us being saved by Jesus' work on the cross. Why is this important? Because ultimately, we shouldn't view these commandments as commandments we try to fulfill and live out ourselves, to justify ourselves before God. Because ultimately, we all fail at these commandments most days. We fail to meet that perfect standard that God expects of us. But there is one who has lived out the 10 commandments perfectly, who has fulfilled the requirements of the law. And that is Jesus. You see, we are accepted by simply believing in Jesus, accepting his offer of forgiveness through his sacrifice on the cross for us, so that we can be forgiven of sin, have a relationship with God where Jesus comes into our life and helps us to live out those 10 commandments in our lives. Not for our own strength, but through Jesus in our lives. Let me illustrate how this works. Maybe you have children, you have a family. We may give them many rules and guidelines, okay? But is there acceptance in the family based on observance of these rules and guidelines in your family? No, of course not. They're part of your family. They're loved. They're accepted. But of course, we do journey with them to help them get the best out of life, to come away from disobedience. But that doesn't take away our love for them. They are accepted. They are part of the family. Likewise, if you put your trust in Jesus, you are part of the family. Jesus has saved you. He has rescued you. And so this is really important. We must view these commandments through the lens of Jesus. That's what the Israelites had to do. They needed to understand they were saved. They were accepted by God. Not because of their own moral performance, but because of God's work in their lives. So let's be viewing this through the lens of Jesus and what he's done for us. Nonetheless, these commandments still play an important role for us as Christians. They really do. It doesn't dismiss them, the fact that what Jesus has done for us. There are 3 things that these commandments really help us with. Firstly, they show us God's character and who he is. See, if you want to know what a leader of an organization or a company is about, you look at the values they set. What values do they set? What values do they live by? And you look at maybe the people in the organization. What values are they living by? This reflects the leader. So if you want to know what God is about, who God is, what Christianity is about, you look at the values he sets. And we see this here in the commandments. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's a basis and a roadmap for our relationship with God. How can we get the best out of our relationship with God? How can we be most fruitful in our lives? How can we flourish in our lives? The 10 Commandments give us a great guide and roadmap for that. And lastly, thirdly, just as we get into this, they show us where we fail. Not so much where we succeed, but actually where we fail. If we understand the expectation from these commandments, it should point us to our great need to come to Jesus for his help with all these different commandments. Now, I don't know about you, as a teenager, I loved rules, okay? Because rules were there as a challenge to break, okay? Now, you might be thinking, isn't this a bit restrictive? Why would God impose all these guidelines and laws and commandments on us? I'd rather be free. I'd rather be free of all these constraints. Well, true freedom is not found in having no laws or rules. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Sports, society, family life, pub quizzes online on a Friday evening, they all depend on having laws and rules to make things work and to give everyone a chance of flourishing in those situations. They bring order, structure, peace, and prevent harm, stress, and danger. Maybe in lockdown you have found that in your family life you've had to impose a few extra rules to get through this season and to keep order and sanity. See, if we don't follow these, it causes trouble for us and those around us, doesn't it? Generally, laws and rules. I'll tell you a story of my time in South Africa. I was a 21-year-old playing cricket, and I was in South Africa for 3 months playing for a club in Cape Town. And I was 2 or 3 days into my trip, and it was a Thursday night, training night with the team, and we would have a braai after the training session. Now, for those that don't know what a braai is, I'm not sure our South African friends amongst us will agree with this description, but basically a braai is a much less sophisticated barbecue, okay? They don't have gas, they don't have charcoal, they just have a few logs of wood, okay? So that's a braai for you. And the family that was looking after me had a son called Peter. He was 18, and he was cooking the meat for us as a guest early on in the trip. Okay, and he had what looked like a long curly piece of meat. I'm not sure what it was, but I was hungry and I was happy to eat it. But basically, Peter was really hungry as well. And so he came to cook the meat and basically threw the rule book on how to barbecue or braai properly. Okay, threw it out the window. Now, us as Brits, we know how to barbecue, don't we? You make sure the meat is cooked through, you make sure the juices are running clear, and it's safe to eat, okay? Peter decided to throw that all out the window, and so we ate this food, and we paid the price for it. 2 or 3 hours later, we were both puking up through the night for 24 hours. See, it pays to follow good guidance, doesn't it? See, God has created us, and he therefore knows what is best for us. And so it's in this safe, trusting relationship with God that human life could flourish. So we have here the commandments. The first 4 commandments are about how we relate to God. The second 6 are how we relate to each other, often referred to as the social commandments. And we will look at these next week. But first is our relationship with God. Get that right, and only when we get that right do we have a chance of getting the social commandments right.